feeling? Tired? Good. How long? Yeah.
Okay, the live stream's up.
Oh, really?
So.
That is awesome. Okay. So we're ready to rock and roll. Okay.
paper circulation. It does resemble him. I'm sure it's him. Dr. Sanders PD.
Man in the camera, man. Man in the camera. Oh, I don't know. I mean, it could. I don't know for a very long time. Maybe it could be, yeah, because the speech and the questions and answers would take a while. You know? Yeah, two is four.
No, I don't know who he is.
That's right, yeah, okay. Alright. Thank you, sir. I kind of checked one couple of days now. I really started without like so what I guess is good, but I'm not too bad. You go back to I think it's kind of
Is this gonna work, do you think?
it is working.
Oh, it is working.
Yeah.
Good.
So yeah, it works for solid.
So I gotta work at 7 and I'm gonna just watch it in between work.
Oh yeah, there you go, right?
Yeah. Sweet. Is it streaming live right now, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah. Everyone can hear you. Haven't. So Robert Spencer's the one right there. No, the one talking the who's the left right here. The guy who's kind of bald. Yeah, there's Robert Spencer. Oh no, I think it's Robert Spencer. I mean, yeah, we did. We talked quite a while. Pretty good. It's a very significant number. I know, right? Where's the confused? I mean, listen. That one can't help. Yeah, on our YouTube account. I would assume so, but I say that. You guys being live stream? Yeah, we're streaming live from that camera, yeah. Yeah, right. We have, right? Yeah, on our YouTube account, streaming live. It's awesome.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Nate Honeycutt. I'm the president of the Cal Poly College Republicans, and we're very excited to have you all here for our presentation tonight. Being the Republican Club on campus, we have a certain set of values and principles that we believe are important to be strong advocates for, and a message that we think is very important to get out. We really believe that the future of our nation is at risk, and that our values, principles, and just the core of what Republicans believe and what conservatives believe are what's going to keep our nation from disaster. So we bring to campus speakers to be a voice for our cause and to bring attention to important issues and to bring together the campus and many of the local community as well to spark discussion and a critical analysis of important issues of today, of our day and age. Some claim that academia is the only place for a critical discussion of controversial topics. And some say that this is where really a true debate happens and where all ideas can be hashed out properly, and where things are discussed in a fair and accurate manner. I don't know what the experience for all of you is like, but I know for myself and many people in our club and many of our supporters, we don't believe that academia provides a forum for fair and accurate discussion, which is why we believe it's important to hold events like this. So to continue the tradition, we have with us tonight our guest speaker, Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer is the director of the website Jihad Watch, which is a program of the David Horowitz Freedom Center. And he's the author of numerous best-selling New York Times best-selling books. He's an active conservative blogger and has led numerous seminars on Islam and jihad for the U.S. Central Command, U.S. Army Command, FBI, CIA, and many other United States intelligence agencies. He definitely knows his stuff, and it's quite a pleasure for us to have him here tonight. Mr. Robert Spencer.
Is this on? I'm not even sure it's necessary. I can speak loud enough. But in any case, thank you all for coming. Tonight, as we come here, the world's attention is focused on the crisis in Nigeria and the girls who were abducted. And international outrage has quite justifiably been directed against the group that is responsible for that abduction. And that group, of course, is Boko Haram, which translates to Western education is sinful. That is, any education that is not based on the Quran and Islamic principles is not acceptable to them to such a degree that they have committed many, many acts of violence, not just this one, in Nigeria. As a matter of fact, they have killed over 2,500 people in Nigeria in the first 3 months of 2014. The actual name of the group is not Boko Haram at all, and this is little known and little reported. The actual name of the group is the Party of the People of the Sunnah for Dawah and Jihad, Sunnah being accepted Islamic practice and Dawah being Islamic proselytizing. So the group explicitly and officially avows that it is an Islamic organization with Islamic goals. And this creates a certain kind of cognitive dissonance because in the West, especially over the last few days, we have seen many, many Muslim groups condemn Boko Haram, condemn the abduction of the schoolgirls, and maintain that it has nothing to do whatsoever with Islam and indeed violates Islamic principles. Now, what are we to think when faced with contrary claims of that kind? Abu Bakr Shekau, the leader of Boko Haram, or the Party of the People of the Sunnah for Dawah and Jihad, has said that he did abduct the girls and he will sell them by Allah. Now, when he said he had abducted the girls and would sell them by Allah, it was not just a pious expression. He was explaining that he would sell them according to the rules that had been laid out in the Quran and in Islamic teaching for what one does with abducted people. In chapter 4, verse 3 of the Quran, it says that a man can have as many as 4 wives, as well as the captives of his right hand. The captives of his right hand has been widely interpreted in Islamic tradition as referring precisely to girls who are abducted and then pressed into sexual slavery. This is something that is also supported by chapter 47, verse 4 of the Quran, which says, when you meet the unbelievers, strike at their necks, and then you take hostages. You have 4 choices for them. Either enslave them, kill them, ransom them, or free them outright. These things, I don't want you to take my word for, because after all, you probably know that I'm a notorious Islamophobic hate-monger. And so, that being the case, let's not believe me at all. Let's go to a respected and mainstream Islamic authority, Syed Abu Allah Maududi, Maulana Maududi, who was a Pakistani politician and jihad theorist, the founder of Jamaat Islami, which is still the largest Islamist political party in Pakistan, and an Islamic scholar who wrote a multi-volume commentary on the Quran. He died in 1979. His works are widely respected. If you go into any Islamic bookstore, if you go to IslamicBookstore.com online or any other online Islamic bookstore, you will find his books. And I guarantee you, if you have a brick-and-mortar Islamic bookstore around this area, it will have Maududi's writings in it. This is a copy of the Quran that I actually received as a gift. I was in London a few years back, and I did what any tourist in London would do. I went to the local mosques. And in the Finsbury Park Mosque, I was very kindly received and given, among many other books, this edition of the Quran. The Finsbury Park Mosque won international notoriety a few years back for being the mosque of Abu Hamza al-Masri, who is an imam who is now actually on trial in the United States for trying to set up a terrorist training camp in Oregon. And he was operating out of the Finsbury Park Mosque in London. But once I was in there in 2009, and by then he was long gone. I did ask about him, though. I said, I hear that you had some trouble here a few years back. And they said, yes, we did. There were extremists here, but now they're all gone, and we're all moderates. And they were very kind, very friendly, and they gave me this Quran, which is a very helpful edition. It has a translation into English of the Quran, not only, however, just the words of the Quran translated into English, but also commentary by Maududi himself, so that we can understand the verses in their proper context and as they are understood in, at least by a large number of Muslims around the world. And so Maududi said, in connection with chapter 4, verse 3 of the Quran, in referring to the phrase, those whom your right hands possess, that is, you can marry up to 4 women, or if you can't treat them justly, just one, or from among those your right hands possess, he says, this expression denotes slave girls, i.e. female captives of war, who are distributed by the state among individuals when no exchange of prisoners of war takes place. So when Abu Bakr Shakal said that he would sell the girls by Allah, he was explaining, and he has explained actually in other places at greater length, that what he was doing was completely in accord with Islamic law regarding female captives. He did offer, after having forcibly converted the others to Islam, which is in violation of chapter 2, verse 256 of the Quran, there's no compulsion in religion. He did indeed violate that, although probably he would have some explanation for what he did there. In any case, he said that those who refused to convert to Islam, he would ransom for the Boko Haram prisoners who were being held by the Nigerian government. And so, you have the 4 choices that chapter 47, verse 4 offers for the kidnapping of, how to deal with hostages. You can free them, you can ransom them, you can enslave them, or kill them. He enslaved some of them, he wants to ransom some others. But he says that he's completely within the bounds of Quranic teaching and Islamic orthodoxy. Maududi would seem to back that up. The last few days, I've seen several people say that this is a complete violation of Islam. Arslan Iftikhar, for example, wrote in CNN, Arslan Iftikhar is the Muslim guy, that's what he calls himself, and he has a site of that name. And he used to be an official of the Council on American Islamic Relations, quite prominent on TV an awful lot to give a Muslim perspective on issues. And he wrote a very helpful piece in CNN about how this had nothing to, the abduction of the schoolgirls had nothing to do with Islam. And I read it with great interest. I also read with great interest one that was in the Huffington Post by a leader of the Ahmadi Muslim community who said the same thing, that this was in total violation of the Quran. What I wanted to see in these writings, in these rebukes of Boko Haram, was some explanation of chapter 4, verse 3 of the Quran, which talks about taking the captives of your right hand, which is also repeated in chapter 4, verse 24 and other verses. And chapter 47, verse 4, about the taking of hostages and the various choices you have once you take those hostages. Unfortunately, neither Arslan Iftikhar nor the Ahmadi Muslim leader even mentioned those verses, even to give an alternative explanation of them. It would have been refreshing and welcome had they both, or either one of them, or anyone else, said, well, these verses have been understood in the past by certain groups among the Islamic community to mean kidnapping and enslaving girls in this way. But this must be rejected on Islamic grounds for this reason, etc., etc., to offer an alternative. such that the understanding of Islam that Abu Bakr Shakal represents would be rebuked, would be refuted, and thus would not have the power to inspire people to commit similar kinds of atrocities in the future. Unfortunately, they did not take that opportunity. They did not do that. And that brings us to really the heart of the problem. There are, everywhere I go, and of course today here, I was just on the radio, I forget the name of this, KBEC. Yes, KBEC, thank you. Dave Congleton. Anyway, good man, and we had an excellent wide-ranging discussion. And in the course of the discussion, the article in the paper here was brought up, and the idea that it's some terrible thing to have Spencer come and talk to you, because what I will do is incite violence. Now, actually, what I'm doing is talking about how violence is incited and how violence is justified in the Islamic tradition, and calling upon Muslims of goodwill as well as non-Muslims of goodwill to work to fight against that violence and to fight against that incitement, so that it does not happen that girls are abducted from school and enslaved and everything else that happens to them. The problem, however, is that it has become, in the present political environment, impossible to discuss this, impossible to raise such questions or to make such points without being accused of hatred and bigotry and so on. Now, this is not about me. It is what this represents, the idea that any of this would be remotely controversial to anyone in this room, anything that I have said so far, or anything that I have ever said in the past, or will say in the future, the idea that any of it could be remotely controversial is the result of an ongoing campaign to stigmatize and demonize and marginalize not just me, but anybody who speaks honestly about this threat. And this is how it works. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation is a 57 government Muslim organization, 56 nations plus the Palestinian Authority. Worldwide body, obviously. 57 states, like Obama thinks that we have. And it is the largest voting bloc in the United Nations since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, for years now, has been embarked upon a campaign to convince Western nations, most notably, but not solely, the United States, to criminalize what it calls incitement to religious hatred. Now, incitement to religious hatred, it would seem to me, would be constituted by someone who kidnaps schoolgirls and says that he is enslaving them and is doing so according to religious imperatives. Incitement to religious hatred, however, I do not believe is constituted by reporting on those activities and noting that they are happening. This is the sleight of hand that has been put over on us in the public discourse in America and in the West in general these days. The OIC decries the linking of Islam with terrorism, which is great. I'm glad they decry the linking of Islam with terrorism, because I don't like terrorism, and I don't think anybody ought to. And anything that incites to terrorism ought to be resolutely rejected and fought against. However, when they say that they decry the linking of Islam with terrorism, they're not referring to Abu Bakr Shakal, or Anwar al-Awlaki, or Osama bin Laden, or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, or Nidal Malik Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, or the Tsarnaev brothers in Boston, or any of the other Islamic terrorists who have cited the Quran, cited the teachings of Muhammad, cited the teachings of Islamic law in order to justify violence and supremacism. They don't mean them at all. They mean me and people like me. As if we were the ones who had made up the connection between Islam and terrorism. It's ridiculous, but it is very widely repeated. Just recently, the Grand Mufti of the Caucasus, from which Tamerlan Tsarnaev and his brother Dzhokhar came, said that it's a terrible thing that in the West there was so much Islamophobia that there were actually public speakers who linked Islam with terrorism. And I think, well, there's a real good way to stop that, and that is to stop the Islamic jihadis who are constantly linking Islam with terrorism. But what they want to do is deflect attention away from those jihadis and give the impression to people that reporting accurately on the motives and goals of jihad terrorists is what links Islam with terrorism. If a jihad terrorist quotes the Quran to justify what he has done, as Major Hassan did, as Muhammad Atta did, Muhammad Atta, the 9/11 hijacker, left behind a letter in which he quoted the Quran 24 times in the space of 2 pages in explaining and justifying what he was about to do. And yet, it's not Muhammad Atta who links Islam with terrorism. It is somebody who reports on the fact that Muhammad Atta quoted the Quran so many times and understood what he was doing and was energized to do what he did in the name of Islam. Those are the people who are linking Islam with terrorism. Now, this is absurd. This is George Orwell world. This is war is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. If you don't know what I'm referring to, read the book 1984. It's a good book. It's a good book about a totalitarian world in which the truth is against the law. And it's coming. We're getting there. And we're getting there because of initiatives like this, where truth and honest discussion of these things is labeled hate speech and incitement to violence. Now, how far exactly has this advanced? It has advanced quite far. For example, I believe that Nate did tell you when I came in that I used to train FBI, CIA, military groups, and so on. What I would train them in was obviously not calisthenics. It was teaching them about the beliefs and the goals of the jihad terrorists. Obviously, if jihad terrorists have vowed to destroy us, it's very important that we understand them, understand what they believe, what they think, what they want to do, how they expect to go about it. It's very important that we understand these things because obviously you cannot defeat an enemy you cannot understand. I did that for about 5 years. And then, on October 19th, 2011, 57 organizations, mostly Muslim organizations, but other allied groups, South Asian organizations and other groups, wrote a letter, a collective letter to John Brennan, who was then the Homeland Security Advisor and is now, of course, the head of the CIA. And in it, they pointed out that I and a few others were training FBI and other groups, and that there was all this material in the training material for agents who were working in counterterrorism that linked Islam with terrorism. And they said that this was terrible and that it had to stop. And Brennan immediately complied. He actually wrote a letter back on White House stationery. Now, I expect that most or all of you have paid taxes at this point, even in your young lives, and they got a lot of money in Washington. They all have their own stationery. They don't need to borrow. When he put it on White House stationery, he was emphasizing how important the Obama administration considered this to be. And he immediately assured them that there would be no mention of Islam or jihad in connection with terrorism. Now, here again, this is upside down, bizarro world, because if there are terrorists who are committing acts of violence and justifying them and making recruits among peaceful Muslims by justifying them with reference to the Quran and to Islamic teaching, then to prescind voluntarily from investigating that is to cut ourselves off from knowing anything about these people who have this will to destroy, which is only going to allow them to continue to operate under cover of darkness. So, that's exactly what happened. That was exactly the result. Right around the same time that this exchange happened between the organizations who were complaining and John Brennan, the Russian government sent the FBI information about a man named Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who is, of course, the Boston Marathon bomber. And they said that Tamerlan Tsarnaev was, and I quote, a follower of radical Islam and a strong believer who has tried to join underground groups in Dagestan. Now, I don't know how many of you here have ever been to Dagestan, but the only underground groups in Dagestan are Islamic Jihad terror groups, are Al-Qaeda. It's a hotbed of Al-Qaeda activity, as well as other organizations of the same ideology. So, they told this to the FBI. The FBI made a perfunctory investigation and did nothing. On September 11th, 2011, right before Brennan got his letter and acted upon it, but after the Russians had told the FBI about Tamerlan Tsarnaev and his brother went to see 3 friends of theirs who they knew from the gym. Remember, Tamerlan was a boxer. And these 3 guys were having a party, and they went over there, and they slit their throats. And they murdered them. And Tamerlan Tsarnaev was on record at that time as having been, remember, a follower of radical Islam who had tried to join underground groups in Dagestan. And these 3 guys were also Jews, and there is a lot of enmity among Islamic jihadis for Jews, whom the Quran designates in chapter 5, verse 82, as the worst enemies, the hottest in hatred for the Muslims. So, did Tamerlan Tsarnaev get tried for this murder? He didn't even get charged. He didn't even get investigated. It wasn't until after he blew up the Boston Marathon that it was discovered that he had anything to do with those murders at all. If, however, the FBI had acted upon the information it got from the Russians and had Tamerlan Tsarnaev under surveillance, those 3 guys might be alive today, and even if not, then surely after they were killed, the FBI would have known enough to connect up this man who was their friend with the information from the Russians and considered maybe this man's a suspect. But because right around that time, the FBI was committing itself to not look into this ideology, to not look into this belief system, it was just the wrong time for the Russians to tell the FBI that. And they completely missed all the cues and missed all the opportunities to prevent the bombing. Also consider this, those pressure cooker bombs that they used in the Boston Marathon. Those things, they come from an article in an Al-Qaeda magazine called Inspire, which you can easily find online even now. And in it, it tells you the actual article is called How to Build a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. And it tells you all the ingredients you need to assemble to make a pressure cooker bomb exactly like the ones that they used. That means that Tamerlan Tsarnaev had to go out of his house and go to the hardware store and buy some stuff. And the stuff that he bought just happens to be all the things that the Al-Qaeda magazine said would make a good pressure cooker bomb. But nobody was paying attention. Maybe if they had been watching him at that time, they would have thought, oh, he's buying all the ingredients for the pressure cooker bomb, and stopped him before it happened. Unfortunately, it is not politically correct to do that now. The Obama administration has officially signed on to the idea that it is hateful, bigoted, and racist and Islamophobic, even to discuss, even to explore how jihad terrorists use the texts and teachings of Islam in order to justify violence, to make recruits among peaceful Muslims, and to spread a supremacist agenda. Now, obviously there are many Muslims, millions of Muslims, around the world today who have no interest in this agenda and who are not furthering it. And they have no interest in ever committing a terrorist act. They might not even agree with Maududi when he says something else. There's a verse in the Quran, chapter 9, verse 29, it says, "Fight those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book," which is the Quran's term for Jews and Christians primarily, "until they pay the jizya," which is a tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Fight those who do not obey Allah and His Messenger, and do not forbid what He has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, that became the basis for an elaborate superstructure of laws in Islamic law throughout history that denied basic rights to Jews and Christians in the Islamic State because they had to willingly submit and feel themselves subdued. And they had to pay the tax that the Muslims were exempt from paying, and thus finance the growth of the Islamic State. But here again, don't believe me, this is what Maududi says about the verse. The purpose for which the Muslims are required to fight is not, as one might think, to compel the unbelievers into embracing Islam. And that's absolutely true, of course, as I said before, there's no compulsion in religion, chapter 2, verse 256. Rather, its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty, the rule, of the unbelievers, so that the latter are unable to rule over people. The authority to rule should only be vested in those who follow the true faith. Unbelievers who do not follow this true faith should live in a state of subordination. Anybody who becomes convinced of the truth of Islam may accept the faith of his or her own volition. The unbelievers are required to pay jizya, poll tax, in return for the security provided to them as the dhimmis, protected people of an Islamic state. Jizya symbolizes the submission of the unbelievers to the suzerainty of Islam. Now, there are many millions of Muslims in the world, as I was saying, who have no interest in this program, no interest in this agenda. They have no interest in furthering the Muslim Brotherhood's goal that was enunciated in a captured internal document that was discovered a few years back, of eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hand, that is the hand of the people of Western civilization, and the hands of the believers, so that it falls and Allah's religion is victorious over other religions. Now, what would be a good thing for anyone, Muslim or non-Muslim, who opposes those agendas, who opposes those ideas, to do? I would suggest respectfully that it would not be to deny that such agendas exist. Obviously they do. And obviously there are people acting upon them. I would also suggest that a proper response would be not to heap abuse and defamation upon those who call attention to the fact that they exist, because that doesn't do anything to stop the people who are spreading these ideas. The best thing to do would be to confront these ideas head-on within the Muslim community and to enunciate an alternative vision that refuted their understanding of the Quran and refuted their understanding of their responsibilities as Muslims, so that there would be no possibility that people like Abu Bakr Shakau and others would be able to recruit among peaceful Muslims. And yet there is no program today in mosques in the West, or anywhere else for that matter, that actually teaches believers why Osama bin Laden and Abu Bakr Shakau and all these other people are wrong and their understanding of Islam is wrong, and their understanding of the Quran and their understanding of Muhammad's words and deeds is wrong. This is the problem of incitement that we really face. This is the difficulty that the world faces, that anyone, Muslim and non-Muslim, who wants to live as equals with other people and not have one group have hegemony over the other, that anyone who believes in a free society in which there is the freedom of speech, this is the challenge to those ideas. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation's program to stifle and stigmatize any honest discussion of how Islamic jihadis use the texts and teachings of Islam to justify violence and supremacism is ultimately one that would destroy the freedom of speech altogether. As Voltaire said, if you want to know who rules over you, find out who you cannot criticize. And freedom of speech is our fundamental bulwark against tyranny. The Founding Fathers made it the First Amendment of the Constitution because it is the foundation of all of the freedoms that any free people enjoy. If you do not have the freedom of speech, the tyrant can do whatever he wants, and you can't say a word to him. If you do not have the freedom of speech, The tyrant can say that what you are saying is hate speech, and thus rule it out of bounds, out of the realm of acceptable discourse, and declare that it is unacceptable for you to be able to speak. And yet the tyrant may be the one who is actually committing injustices. And if that is the case, and you do not have the freedom of speech, there ain't nothing you can do about it. So, what we face today is a global terror threat of people who, by their own words, are inspired by and incited to violence by the teachings of the Quran and Muhammad. I'm sorry that's the case. And you can call me all sorts of names all you want. I've heard worse. However, I didn't make that up, and I didn't make people say these things. I am merely reporting on them. For example, I'll bet there are some of you who never even heard of Boko Haram until last few days. Now, let me tell you something. I have a website, Jihad Watch, that tracks jihad activity in the United States and around the world. I've been doing that every day of my life since October 2003. Yes, you're right, I have no life. And if you do a search at Jihad Watch for Boko Haram, you will find 115,000 responses. That is, I have written about Boko Haram and their various murderous activities 115,000 times over the last 11 years. If you go to the Council on American Islamic Relations website, a website that has numerous denunciations of me and my colleagues for our hateful linking of Islam with terrorism, and you look for Boko Haram there, you will find one reference. So, who has been sounding the alarm about Boko Haram all these years? The so-called hateful, bigoted Islamophobes. What has been the effect of the demonization of the so-called hateful, bigoted Islamophobes such that it is controversial that you're even here and that we're even discussing this and that I'm being allowed to speak here? The effect is that most people have no idea of the nature and magnitude of the threat we're facing. And when finally the international media suddenly notices something like Boko Haram abducting schoolgirls, which is only like the 10,000th atrocity they've committed over the last few years, but this is the first one they've noticed, the thing is people are blindsided and they have no idea what's going on. If you do not know, if you are ill and you do not know what ails you, you can't take the right medicine. And not being able to talk about a threat of an oppression that threatens Muslims and non-Muslims, everyone in the world, is only to allow it to grow. So we face a global terror threat, but even worse than that, we face the imminent possibility that it will be impossible to discuss it, and that people who discuss it will be so demonized and stigmatized that it will be able to advance unimpeded and unopposed. And that's really the agenda of the OIC. One final example. A few years back, there was a jihad terror plot at Fort Dix. You all know about the Fort Hood plot, right? The workplace violence that killed 13 people in Fort Hood. But in Fort Dix, there was a plot. A group of Muslims were going to go into Fort Dix, and they were going to shoot as many American soldiers as possible before they were killed themselves. Suicide mission, in accord with the promise of paradise in chapter 9, verse 111 of the Quran, to those who kill and are killed for Allah. So, they didn't go into Fort Dix. They got caught. How did they get caught? Not by the FBI, not by the NSA, not by wiretapping. They got caught by a kid in a video store. 17 years old. And he worked in this video store. And these jihadis brought in their VHS tapes. They liked to watch beheadings and shootings and mutilations and such. They liked that stuff. And so they had them, but they had them on VHS tapes. So they took them to this kid and they said, will you please transfer these to DVD for us? And so he's doing his job and it's rolling by. Apparently he was seeing them as he's transferring. And he sees all this blood and gore. And he sees this glorification of murder and bloodshed and so on. And so he goes to his manager. And he said, dude, I'm seeing some weird stuff here. Should I go to the police, or would that be racist? Now, let me tell you something else. The plotters in this case were Albanians. They were Muslims from Albania. They were white guys. The video store clerk was a white kid. This has nothing to do with race whatsoever. This is an ideology that is held by people of all races and oppresses people of all races. The idea that it's racist to speak out against Boko Haram and to speak up for those Nigerian schoolgirls, well, the absurdity of it is obvious. But in any case, so the kid decided that he would go ahead and be a hateful, bigoted, racist Islamophobe, and he reported them to the police, and the plot was foiled. But even the fact that he would think for a minute and stop and say, gee, would it be racist if I went to the cops on these guys? It shows how much this Orwellian agenda of making the truth into hate speech has advanced, and how dangerous it is for it to advance. And so I am here today to tell you that if we don't have the courage to turn that around and to stand up and say truth is not hate speech, fighting for the equality of rights of all people against an ideology that would oppress whole segments of humanity is not hate speech, defending the freedom of speech against those who would violently suppress it for those whom they do not like is not hate speech. And if we don't do that, if we don't stand up, then they will prevail, most certainly. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, comments, I would be happy to listen, but please do not engage in a counter lecture. I will be glad to come back here if you schedule the time to speak and listen to your lecture and ask you probing questions. But in the meantime, tonight you ask me the questions and I will answer. Anybody?
What is your feeling about the translation by Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall?
Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall was an English convert to Islam in the early 20th century. He wrote a translation of the Quran that is very widely read in English. It's not as popular as it used to be because it's in very stilted language. The translations by Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall and Abdullah Yusuf Ali, who wrote his a little later in the 1930s, they are both sort of severely handicapped because the King James Bible was the common Bible in English at the time, and that was written in the 17th century, and was it 1611? And so people didn't speak English the way we speak English now, and it's very, these and thous and all that. And so they put the translations of the Quran into that kind of English, which makes it very dense and difficult, but I guess they were thinking this is how scriptures sound in English. This is what people are used to. In any case, the bigger problem is that there's a certain tendency, Ali more than Pickthall, to whitewash unpleasant aspects. For example, in chapter 4, verse 34, where it says, good women are obedient, and as for those who are not, give them a warning, send them to separate beds, and beat them. In Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation, it says, beat them lightly. But there's no lightly in the Arabic. Oh, he doesn't know Arabic, he doesn't know that. Okay, look it up. There's no lightly in the Arabic. So anyway, yes?
Yeah, I was wondering what your credentials are, like where you went to school, what you majored in.
I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I majored in English literature, and I got a BA in 1983, and I got an MA in religious studies from the same institution in 1986 after taking a year off. That was a wild year too. And you are trying to imply, of course, because this is not the first time I've heard the question, so pardon me if I extrapolate, that I must not know what I'm talking about because I do not have a degree in Islamic studies. Well, in the first place, I would not get a degree in Islamic studies today, and I wouldn't have in 1986 either, because the Middle East Studies Association enforces an ideological lockstep such that you only can have one point of view, which is actually true all across the board in all fields, in academia today and in most universities today. And it's a shame because, universities talk all about diversity and let's have diversity, and diversity is our strength. But there's one kind of diversity that's not allowed, and that's diversity of thought. Everybody has to have the same ideas, the same priorities, the same political views. There's no diversity allowed. Anyway, I do not have a degree in Islamic studies. Does that mean everything I'm saying is wrong? You're welcome to think that. However, at the same time, everything that, I've written 13 books about various aspects of Islam and terrorism. They have hundreds and hundreds of footnotes. You were invited to check up on them. You were invited to check up on the Quran quotes and see if anything that is said that is wrong. The thing about this idea that you have to you cannot have learned these things on your own. You have to have a degree in it. Well, I know lots of professors who are idiots. Now, maybe you're in college and so you know that not to be true, but I kind of doubt it. And I also know lots of people who have learned things on their own and report on things completely accurately. So my work stands on its accuracy. And I note that it was interesting that in all the protests against my appearing here, nobody ever actually specified anything I said that was wrong. They said, oh, he doesn't have any credentials, and oh, he's full of hate, and so on and so on. But nobody said, he says X, but it's really Y. And they can't, because what I say is true. Yes, sir?
Can a good Muslim be a good American?
Can a good Muslim be a good American? Well, I guess it depends on your definition of all those words. You know? Good, Muslim, and American. And obviously, if you asked Maududi, can a good Muslim be a good American, he would say no, because he would say Muslims have to be working for the hegemony of the Islamic State and not obeying infidel laws, unless they are in America to work for the hegemony of the Islamic State and aren't sold out, you know. That would be, I mean, it's certainly not Maududi alone who would say that. That would be the view of the so-called extremists and the people who lead jihad groups around the world today. There are others who would differ and say that there is no incompatibility because in a non-Muslim state, in a state that does not impose Islamic law, then Muslims are bound to obey the law of the land. And that's that. If there's no attempt to assert anything else contrary to the freedoms of the Constitution and the ideas enunciated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, then there ought to be no problem. Yes, sir?
What do you think about Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization?
Well, I think nothing has been more abundantly proven as correct over the last 20 years since Samuel Huntington wrote The Clash of Civilizations, but that thesis itself. And he predicted that there would be conflict, escalating conflict, everywhere that there were large numbers of Muslims and non-Muslims. And we see that. We see it in the Philippines, we see it in Indonesia, in Thailand, in Burma, in Bangladesh, in India, all across Central Asia, into Africa, Nigeria, of course. And so, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. There were lots of people who refuted Samuel Huntington's work and dismissed it. The only thing that's proven him correct is reality. Yes, sir?
I'm not really an expert in this field or any for that matter, but you know, there's always some number of extremists in any group that gets large enough, and I don't have any figures myself. I was wondering if you knew, like, you know, the FBI records like terrorist acts that happen and whatnot, and tries to get information on who commits them. I was wondering if you knew what like the per capita rates of different groups were. 'Cause I know there's also like.
Are you referring to that study that says 94% of terrorist acts are committed not by Muslims? That's what I figured. That study, if you look at it, they will say that the 9/11 was one terrorist act, and PETA going and throwing blood on somebody wearing a fur was another terrorist act. And so that's how they counted. It's kind of skewed.
Yeah, no, I meant, so if that study's skewed, if there's other studies that, you know, maybe only are classifying, you know, acts that, you know, had intent to harm or kill or something. So not that study in particular, but do you have other numbers that you yourself would call more reliable?
Well, sure. There have been 23,000 jihad terror attacks that resulted in fatalities since 9/11 around the world. Over 23,000. If you want to compare that to acts of terror committed by other groups, I don't know that there are comparable figures. Maybe you can enlighten me on that. But, people like the guy today on the radio, somebody said, well, they're Christian extremists too. What about those abortion doctors who were killed? Well, I'm not aware that there were any more than about 10 of those. And the thing about the abortion doctors being killed is that there's no justification for doing such a thing in the scriptures of Christianity, and their actions were condemned by all the churches. Now, at the same time as you can say, well, yes, but of course, all these Muslim groups have condemned terrorism, and I welcome that. That's a great thing. The problem is there are others, like Maududi, who write these things saying that Muslims have to fight against unbelievers until they rule over them and deny them basic rights. And this seems to justify that kind of behavior. And Abu Bakr Shakal can point to these passages of the Quran that justify sex slavery. And so it's a little bit of a difficult analogy to make when you have one tiny group that has no support among the larger group and another quite larger group that does have significant support among the still larger group of which it is a subset. Yes, sir.
What do you think is driving this reluctance of the present administration and the political left in this country to even talk about Islamic fundamentalism? I own maybe it's something like the Stockholm mentality.
Yeah, to some degree. But there's more. These groups like the OIC and its exponents in the United States, like the Council on American Islamic Relations and Islamic Society of North America and others, for years now, they have been pounding home the idea that any honest discussion, any jihad, any opposition to jihad terror really, is bigoted and hateful. I mean, I can tell you that CARE puts out Islamophobia reports every few years. And they were nice enough to put my picture on the cover last time. Hi, guys. Anyway, it's all about, how terrible we all are. And it says, in the course of this discussion, there is legitimate criticism of Islam and jihad, but these people are all out of bounds. Spencer and his ilk. The only thing was, that too was a trick. They didn't mention any names for who the people were who were engaging in acceptable criticism. There wasn't a single one, and that's because the assertion itself was dishonest. There has never been a critic of Islamic terror, or, for that matter, a counter-terror legal measure that CARE has supported. Ever. There has never been one. And I get their mailings, their daily mailings, and every few days they're saying, CARE calls upon such and such a group to drop such and such a horrible Islamophobic speaker. And every last person who ever speaks out against terrorism, they target in this way. And this is how far they'll go. The 9/11 Memorial Museum is about to open in New York City. And at the 9/11 Memorial Museum, it's not open yet, but they invited a few people to go in and see their exhibits. And one of them was a local imam in that area. And he watched this video, they all watched this video that the museum has about Al-Qaeda. The video never says anything like all Muslims believe this way, which would be ludicrous because they don't. Or that all Muslims are terrorists, which is obviously also ludicrous. Anything like that. It was just about Al-Qaeda and who they are and what they're trying to do. And that made perfect sense to have in the museum, of course, because those guys were Al-Qaeda who took down the towers, and that's why they took them down. So, this imam said this is a terrible thing because people will see this and think all Muslims think this way, which the film never says. And CARE has now picked it up. And see, I do think that they intimidate people and bamboozle people into thinking that it's somehow going to victimize, well, even like the claims here, that there's going to be violence on the campus. Well, I've never called for violence. Why should there be violence on campus if I come in and talk about not ending violence? I mean, it's ridiculous. But they keep repeating the big lie long enough, and Goebbels told us it works. And they are repeating the idea that it will victimize somehow innocent Muslims if we speak honestly about this. And I think that that is a large part of it. And also that they identify a lot of the left, obviously, with the people who are trying to destroy the United States. And you could say, oh, you're saying the left hates America? Well, it's not really that simple. But they think that the various military adventures into Iraq and Afghanistan and others recently were these terrible things, and that they were oppressive and wrong-headed. And actually, I completely agree with that. But this leads them to such a sympathy with the opposition that I think that it has led them to adopt a good bit of their agenda. Yes, ma'am?
Is it possible that the Muslim religion is being used for the eventual control of society as part of Agenda 21?
I don't know. I don't know anything about that. I'm sorry. I hesitate to speculate on things like that because I work from the facts. You know, everything that I've said here tonight, I can document, and everything that I've said in my books, I can document. And so things that I can't document, I don't tend to speculate about. I mean, I guess anything is possible, but I don't know.
I'm talking about the liberal religion.
Yeah, I know. I just don't know anything about it.
Ellison was the first United States congressman who's Muslim. He took his oath of office apparently on Thomas Jefferson's Koran. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, Keith Ellison is a congressman from Minnesota. And he didn't actually, I should clarify, the House of Representatives, they aren't actually sworn in on the book. They're all sworn in together, all 435 of them. They all get together and they take the oath all at once. But then, because they're politicians, they all have photo ops with the speaker. And it was the photo op with the speaker where Nancy Pelosi is standing there with the Quran and he's holding up, his right hand and swearing on the Quran. It was just a photo op. It wasn't really the real swearing in. It wasn't really the real swearing in for any of the other congressmen who took photos holding the Bible and all that the same way. They're all sworn in together. But, in any case, Keith Ellison is a congressman from Minnesota. He has taken money from the Council on American-Islamic Relations and the Muslim American Society. As a matter of fact, the Muslim American Society gave him $13,350 to finance his Hajj, his pilgrimage to Mecca. Now, the Council on American-Islamic Relations was named an unindicted co-conspirator in a Hamas terror funding case in 2007. Its co-founder and executive director, Nihad Awad, said in 1994, I'm a supporter of the Hamas movement. Hamas is still registered as a terrorist group by the State Department, and supporting them financially, at least, is illegal. One can express whatever he wants, and that's a good thing. We should have more freedom of speech, but we also draw the reasonable conclusions from that speech. And in any case, there are numerous other ties that CARE has to Hamas. It has several of its officials having been arrested and convicted for various jihad terror-related activities. Now, let me ask you this. If there were a congressman who had taken money from any other kind of organization that had ties to a terrorist group of a similar strength and had various of its officials arrested and convicted, nothing to do with Islam, do you think that nobody would care and that he would just get a free pass? He took money from the Muslim American Society, which has been demonstrated repeatedly to be the Muslim Brotherhood's primary organization in the United States. And the Muslim Brotherhood, as I noted before, is dedicated in its own words to eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within. Can you imagine if any other congressman took 13 grand from any other group dedicated to destroying Western civilization, that nobody would care and give him a free pass? I find it very odd, but of course, to look into this about Ellison is racist, bigoted, and Islamophobic, and so it doesn't happen. Yes, sir, in the back.
How do you foresee a geopolitical solution to the religious tension in the Middle East?
How do I foresee a geopolitical solution to the religious tension in the Middle East? Was that it? I'm not sure there is a solution to the religious tension in the Middle East. I don't think that, I think one of the problems is that everybody thinks that there is a solution. And sometimes there isn't. You know, sometimes you have a problem that can't be solved. You just have a problem that can be managed. The problem is that Hamas in its charter has an epigraph from Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. And al-Banna says, Israel will arise and remain until Islam obliterates it. Israel will arise and remain until Islam obliterates it. That's the first thing you see in the Hamas charter. The Palestinian Authority is supposed to be the moderate alternative. Fatah and the PLO, I should say, which run the Palestinian Authority. It's supposed to be the moderate alternative to Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other groups like that. The Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, of course, recently reached an accord with Hamas, and he said even before that he said, as far as I'm concerned, there's no difference between our positions and those of Hamas. So that makes it very difficult to envision any kind of geopolitical solution to the problem, because any negotiated settlement will be seen by Hamas and probably by significant elements of Fatah and the people in the Palestinian Authority government as well, as being a mere stepping stone to their ultimate goal, which is the ultimate destruction of Israel. In accord with chapter 2, verse 191 of the Quran, drive them out from whence they drove you out. And that being the case, that is a kind of, when you come up against religious imperatives of whatever creed, it's very unlikely, indeed I would say inconceivable, that you're going to get them, people who hold them fervently, to negotiate them away. People tend to hold to religious views very strongly, whatever they may be, if they are devout in their religion. And if you have religious principles of that kind, then you're not going to come to a negotiating table and say, well, I'll give this away to you if you give me something else. It militates against pragmatism. Yes, sir?
In the question before this last question, you referenced 2 or 3 times, he took his money from. He took his money from.
Yes.
From whom do you take your money?
From whom do I take my money? I get donors who donate to the 501c3 organization Jihad Watch, and I'm also affiliated with the David Horowitz Freedom Center.
Anybody else?
No.
Is that somewhere that could be looked at?
Yeah, it's on GuideStar. All that's public. You know GuideStar.com? It's very helpful. For 501c3 organizations, the tax returns are all there. Yes, ma'am? I'm sorry?
I have 2 questions about your research.
Uh-huh.
I want to know how much time you spent researching religious groups outside of Islam that have committed terrorist attacks, and how many times you've documented that?
How many times what?
You've documented those terrorist attacks that are committed by groups such as like Christian extremists.
Uh-huh.
Because you mentioned one, the necessity to talk about how violence is incited, and that you need to talk about it so that it does not happen again. So I feel like there should be a need to talk about Christian extremists as well, because that's definitely something that can
Fine. The question, for those of you who didn't hear, was how much time have I spent researching acts of violence committed by extremists of other religions? Is that correct? And if what I say is true, that we need to identify the causes of the incitement so that we can stop the incitement and end the violence, isn't it necessary to talk about Christian extremism as well? Is that correct? Okay. First answer, none. That's not my field. And I don't do that. Does that mean it shouldn't be done or that I oppose it? No. Do I believe that only Muslims commit acts of violence in the name of their religion? No. Do I believe that only Muslims commit acts of violence in general or evil? No. But, you don't go to your cardiologist and say, why don't you deal with podiatry? I specialize in this one thing. I make no apology for that. But certainly, if you think that Christian extremism ought to be investigated, I wholeheartedly approve and wish you all encouragement in that. I have no objection to that whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I wrote a book a few years back called Did Muhammad Exist?, which is a historical investigation of the historicity of the early texts about Muhammad and the origins of Islam. And it was, of course, denounced as racist, bigoted, and Islamophobic, and so on. But at the same time, there was a book that came out right around the same time called Did Jesus Exist? And I thought it's interesting that the titles are exactly the same, Did Jesus Exist by Bart Ehrman. And Bart Ehrman was lauded and praised for having the courage to deconstruct the New Testament understanding of Christianity and to look into the historical bases of the Gospels. And of course, an even more recent example of that is Reza Aslan's book Zealot, which does the same thing. Now, I I don't understand that. I'm all for those guys doing historical investigations of the Gospels and investigating the historicity of the claims of Christianity. I have no objection to that at all. I think that's great. I just think we ought to be able to do it in this other field as well, where it has not been done. And so I trust that you will see the analogy there. Yes?
And then the second question, how much research have you done on the rates of violence before and after you speak against Muslims in the community where you speak?
There is no violence that I have ever incited. It is not possible to incite violence by denouncing violence. It is not possible to incite violence by speaking truthful information about how we need to stop terrorist acts. The idea that people are incited to violence by what I say is as ludicrous as the idea that the Beatles caused the Manson killings by inspiring him with secret messages hidden in their songs. He was nuts, and he thought they were telling him to commit acts of violence. There was actually no acts of there were actually no incitement to violence in those songs. The analogy is exact in this case as well. You can read all my books, you can read all my articles, you can read 40,000 plus blog posts at Jihad Watch, and you will not find a single justification for exhortation to apology for violence of any kind. Yes.
I just have a quick follow-up question. Do you propose any action beyond just presenting the facts?
Do I do what?
Propose to take any action beyond just you presenting the facts?
Oh yeah. I think that we need to bring pressure upon our elected officials to speak about this problem more realistically and hold them to account for the fictions that they purvey. I think that we need to, if there were a sane administration, which I don't foresee anytime, not 2016 or in the foreseeable future, that we would reconfigure our global alliances such that we are not financing the people who want to destroy us. Right after 9/11, George W. Bush made an agreement with President Musharraf of Pakistan that would give $1.3 billion, and the money has since increased, to Pakistan every year to fight against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. It was revealed as long ago as 2008 that a great deal of that money was actually given by the Pakistani government to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. That's insane. We just keep giving, and you know what the U.S. Congress did in response to that revelation was increase the amount of money being given to Pakistan. That's absolutely absurd. And so I would say that if you have a government like that, and also the Pakistani spy service, the ISI, they have been implicated in jihad terror attacks and involvement in the Mumbai bombing in India a few years back, and in plotting more recently against American and Israeli interests. And this is supposed to be our ally. So I would say a government of that kind should not get a penny of American aid. And governments, for that matter, that codify the oppression of women, the oppression of non-believers, the denial of the freedom of speech, and so on, governments of that kind, I think, have at it. Let them do what they're going to do, but they should not consider themselves to be American allies or depend upon American money to finance that oppression.
Does Taqiyya have any relevance today?
Oh, well, sure. Does Taqiyya have any relevance today? Well, chapter 3, verse 28 of the Quran says, do not take unbelievers as your awliya, your friends and protectors. It's your wali, your guardian, your liege lord, as your friends and protectors in preference to believers. Anyone who does this has nothing to do with Allah, unless you are doing it to guard yourselves against them. Let's go to the videotape. Maududi says about that, this means that it is lawful for a believer, helpless in the grip of the enemies of Islam, and in imminent danger of severe wrong and persecution, to keep his faith concealed, and to behave in such manner as to create the impression that he is on the same side as his enemies. Maududi, a lot of people say, well, that's a Shiite idea, and certainly the word taqiyya and the doctrine is a Shiite idea. But Maududi was a Sunni, and the justification comes from the Quran itself to behave as if one is on the side of one's enemies, when in danger and under pressure. Muhammad allowed for lying between a husband and wife and in wartime. And that's very significant when you consider that a lot of Islamic jihadis say that the U.S., despite frequent denials by Bush and Obama, that the U.S. is at war with Islam. And so if they consider the U.S. to be at war with Islam, and then Muhammad says war is deceit and deceit is allowed in wartime, well then you could expect a certain level of it from people who would subscribe to that perspective. Yes, ma'am?
What do you think about Egypt's reaction to the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, I think Egypt's reaction to the Muslim Brotherhood is a most welcome thing and an entirely understandable and human reaction. The Muslim Brotherhood was the most powerful force in Egypt in opposition to Mubarak. And so it was practically inevitable that it would come to power in Egypt after Mubarak fell. But Egypt has a long tradition of secularism and has not been a Sharia state, an Islamic state like Afghanistan or Pakistan even, or Iran or Saudi Arabia. And so when the Brotherhood came in and was so repressive and began to impose those kinds of restrictions, they alienated a lot of their former support. And the demonstrations that toppled them last summer were far larger than the Arab Spring demonstrations that brought them to power in January 2011. So, I think that it's a shame that the regime now is being similarly repressive, because that's just going to create yet another backlash. But the movement that toppled the Brotherhood was a popular movement. I mean, there were 30 million people on the streets. It was astonishing. And it was clear that they were fed up. You know, Islamic law, in its classic formulation with the stonings, stoning for adultery, the amputation of the hand for theft as per chapter 5, verse 38 of the Quran, the various other measures, the essential commodification of women, you know, the beating and so on, the denial of the inheritance rights and all that, the devaluing of the testimony and so on. People don't want to live under that. You know, human beings recoil against that. Human nature being what it is, human nature being everywhere the same around the world. People, you know, might, in a paroxysm of religious fervor, put that on themselves, but then they will want to take it off later. And you see that pendulum swinging back and forth all through Islamic history. You see it now with Iran, and the installation of the Khomeini regime in 1979, and now, obviously from the demonstrations in 2009 that were ruthlessly put down, but there's still quite a lot of discontent, not only with the regime, but with the society that the regime built. Yes, ma'am?
Do you know what percentage of Muslims in the world would be classified as extremists?
Well, it depends on what you mean by extremist and who's doing the classifying. The problem is that these words are thrown around a lot without being properly defined. The U.S. government generally tends to think that a Muslim is only an extremist when in the course of strapping on a suicide vest, and is a moderate up until that point. The problem is that if somebody holds to the beliefs that it is one's responsibility to wage war against and subjugate unbelievers, well, does that classify you as an extremist? Even if you may never act upon it? And so it's really impossible to quantify, because these things are embedded within the Quran and are in widespread understandings of the Quranic text. But obviously most Muslims are never going to act upon them in any way. Yes, ma'am?
I'm curious, what is a moderate Muslim?
What is a moderate Muslim? Well, see, there again, you have a lot of different definitions of the word. People throw it around and assume a meaning that may not be what the hearer means. That's true of a lot of words. But in any case, moderate, it's could be many things. Could be somebody who rejects the understanding of Islam as encapsulated by Maududi in the Quran I brought tonight. And of course, Maududi is not the only person who says these things. Osama bin Laden says these things. Sayyid Qutb, the great Muslim Brotherhood theorist, said these things at great length and with great eloquence. Many, many others. have said much the same things. Somebody who rejects all that and says that Muslims and non-Muslims should live together in harmony as equals on an indefinite basis in a secular state, well, that would be immoderate. But most people, you tend to use the word just for any Muslim who is just going about his business and living his life and raising a family and having a job and so on.
Well, then they don't go by the Quran, is that it?
Well, you know, in every religious tradition, there are people who are very fervent and knowledgeable, and people who are not fervent and knowledgeable, and people who are knowledgeable and not fervent, and people who are neither. And there's a whole spectrum all the way across, from not fervent to fervent, and, you know, partly, and so on, and same thing with knowledgeable. And so it's the same with Judaism, with Christianity, with Islam, with Hinduism, with Buddhism. There are people who care about it very deeply and try to follow it out in every respect. And there are people who identify themselves by the word, but otherwise are indistinguishable from those who do not believe any of it, and all sorts of variations in between. Yes, ma'am?
How did you get interested in this? Like, what inspired you to study so much about this in general?
Oh, don't you think it's neat?
I don't know.
What happened was, actually, my grandparents were born in the last great Islamic empire, the Ottoman Empire. And they left there, they were exiled at the age of 18 and 16. And they went ultimately to New York City. And I knew them much later, of course, and they were very nice old folks who would tell me stories about growing up there. And they loved it, and they said that it was wonderful. And I remember, for example, my grandmother saying, like Barack Obama, that the call to prayer was the most beautiful sound that she had ever heard. She was not a Muslim. She just heard it every morning from her house and thought it was cool. But then they were exiled. And there was this strange disconnect between that and all the marvelous stories they told about how wonderful it was over there. And I was very intrigued by that from a very early age and wondered, how is it that it was so great over there and they got kicked out? They didn't seem to be criminals to me. You know, my grandfather would sit in his rocking chair and smoke a pipe. And he didn't seem to be the kind of guy who would get exiled from a country. Of course, nowadays you just never know. But anyway, I wanted to find out, and they either could not or would not tell me why they were exiled. And so I started to study on it. It was very hard to find information in those days. That was before the internet. And I don't even know what there would be on the internet about this even now. But ultimately, I found out that it was because they were invited to convert to Islam. This was a time of great crisis in the Ottoman Empire. It was collapsing. You may have heard that it was referred in its last 50, 75 years as the sick man of Europe. And it was. And one of the ways in which it was sick was that its minorities, particularly the Armenians and Greeks, were fighting for independence. And the Greeks gained independence in Europe in 1824. But there was a huge number of Greeks who had always lived from time immemorial in western Anatolia, in western Turkey. And they wanted to be independent as well, which led the Ottoman Sultan to declare them Kufar Harbi, infidels at war with Islam, because they were rebelling against the Dhimma, the contract of protection, that is outlined, and actually read it before, that they accept the suzerainty of Islam and live in a state of subordination. And when you reject that, the protection is forfeit, and your life is fair game. So, the same thing with the Armenians. And this was the time of the Armenian genocide. And quite a few of the Greeks as well were murdered, but at the same time, because there was an established nation of Greece, a lot of the Greeks were, instead of being murdered, they were exiled in exchange for Muslims who lived in Europe, in what was then the new state of Greece. And so, anyway, they came to my great-grandfather and his family and said, "You can stay if you convert to Islam." But if you do not convert to Islam, then we will kill you, because you are an infidel at war with Islam, if you were going to stay here. So they left. Actually, they did kill him, but the rest of the family got out. And anyway, I found all this out much later, but by that time, it leads you right into Islam, and into reading the Quran, and into trying to understand how these things could come about. And I had a great curiosity about it, a great fascination for it, which I can't really explain. It's just one of those things, why are you interested in what you're interested in? But I remember years ago, like 1993 or 4, I remember once I was reasonably newly married, and we were going on vacation, and my wife packed a novel to read while we were on vacation, and I packed the Quran, because I think it's interesting to read. Let's see, who have I not? Yes, sir. Did I please? Well, go ahead.
Could you please comment on the Quran's instructions in regards to the Islamic claims to buildings like Dome of the Rock and Mosque in Jerusalem?
The Dome of the Rock, and which was the other one, Al-Aqsa?
Yes.
Yeah, the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque are built on the Temple Mount, which is, of course, the most sacred site in Judaism. And the idea is to show the victory and supremacy of Islam. The Quran in chapter 3, verse 110 says to the Muslims, "You are the best of peoples." Full stop. You are the best people on earth. And chapter 98, verse 6 is the converse of that. It says that the unbelievers among the people of the book, which again, primarily Jews and Christians, are the most vile of created beings. And there are several other passages, chapter 3, 2 verse 89 rather, and various others that say that the humiliation and disgrace will follow the Jews primarily because they have rejected Allah and rejected Muhammad. And so the idea of putting the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount was to enforce that humiliation and disgrace, and to show that the best of people had won out over the most vile of created beings. The idea of Victory Mosque is actually very common all around the Islamic world. The Hagia Sophia, which was at one time the grandest cathedral in the Christian world, was converted to a mosque on May 29, 1453, when the siege of Constantinople finally broke through, and the Sultan entered the great cathedral and ordered a muezzin, the caller to prayer, to go up into the pulpit and to pronounce the Shahada, the confession of faith. There's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his prophet. And then it was a mosque. And the idea was to show, by taking over the grandest church in the Christian world, that Islam was superior to Christianity and had defeated it once again. The Umayyad Mosque in Damascus is another, the former Cathedral of John the Baptist. There are lots of them in India that had been Hindu temples, and so on, all based on the same principle.
Is that the Blue Mosque that you were talking about?
No, the Blue Mosque actually was always a mosque. The Blue Mosque is across from the Hagia Sophia. The Hagia Sophia was a great cathedral, and the Blue Mosque was built later as a mosque. It imitates the architecture of the Hagia Sophia, but it was always a mosque there.
Do you know anything about genocide of Armenians in the
Yes, I do.
20th century?
Yeah.
Take responsibility for it?
Well, the genocide of the Armenians took place in the same context of what I was discussing before with the lady back here, that the Armenians and the Greeks were declared infidels at war with Islam for trying to establish independent states and break free of the Ottoman Empire, which was crumbling. At the same time, the Ottoman Empire crumbling also meant that this was the foundation for the establishment of secular Turkey. Now, the secular Turks did not need to have endorsed this idea and the persecution and expulsion of the Armenians and Greeks. However, they did because they considered that a secular Islam was essential to the identity of the Turk in the new Turkish state that they were trying to establish. And anyway, of course, it's well known that the Turks have never admitted that there was a genocide of the Armenians, never taken responsibility for it, and have even accused those, much like what happens to anybody who speaks out against jihad terror. They have accused those who do speak out about it of hatred and bigotry and so on. In reality, the Armenian genocide is abundantly documented. The New York Times was on the case. There are photographs, there are contemporary news stories. There's really no doubt about it, any more than there is about the Holocaust of the Jews during Nazi Germany times.
How many Armenians were here?
I think about 1.5 million.
And within what period of time?
Mostly between 1914 and 1916, but it went on periodically, sporadically I should say, until 1922.
So they were Christian Armenians?
Yeah, the Armenians and the Greeks were Christians.
And just slaughtered?
Yes, correct. The Armenians were expelled, just like the Greeks were, to east, where the independent state of Armenia is today, which is east of Turkey. But the conditions under which this expulsion took place were so appalling that many of them died on the way, and of course many of them were directly murdered. Yes, ma'am. Oh, I'm sorry, but I will get to you next. Yes, go ahead. Sure.
I was wondering if you had any comments on the genocide of the Native American peoples in this country?
I'm against it. Yes, ma'am.
Hey, my question has to do with the 12th Imam, and I'm wondering at what part do you think that is killing and radicalization of what's happening?
Yeah, the 12th Imam. The 12th Imam is a Shiite idea. Sunni Muslims are about 85 to 90% of Muslims worldwide. Shiites are about 10 to 15%. And the Shiites, however, are, the Twelver Shiism is the official religion of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And so it's a significant force in the Middle East and around the world. The Iranian regime funds Sunni jihadis like Hamas, but it is Shiite itself. Now the distinction is this. The Sunnis believed after the sudden death of Muhammad in 632 that he had not named a successor, and that they should just pick the best man in the community, and he would be the caliph, which means successor, and would lead the Muslims, be the successor to his political, military, and spiritual authority. Now, the Shiites were actually the Shi'at Ali is what the word comes from, the party of Ali. And Ali ibn Abi Talib was the son-in-law of Muhammad, the husband of his daughter Fatima. And the Shiites insisted, the supporters of Ali, the party of Ali, insisted that Muhammad had named Ali as his successor, and that the larger group was criminally passing him over. Ali ultimately was named caliph and was the fourth caliph after Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. And then he was murdered. And then his son was murdered in a battle, was killed in battle in 680 at Karbala in Iraq. And that was really the formal split when there became two groups, the Sunnis and the Shiites. Anyway, the point is that the Shiites differed from the Sunni idea that you just choose the best man in the community. They thought Ali was the successor of Muhammad, but he was the imam. In Sunni Islam, an imam is just like your local parish priest or rabbi. He's the head of the local place of worship. But in Shiite Islam, the imam held something of Muhammad's prophetic spirit and had to be a member of Muhammad's household. And there were 12 of them, up until the middle of the 9th century, around 874, I believe it was, when the 12th imam, who was at that time, I believe, about 5 years old, because this was a hereditary succession, he fell down a well and died. But in Shiite eschatology, he didn't die. He's still there in the well. Mahmud Ahmadinejad built a highway between the well and Tehran because at a certain point, when the Muslims are being persecuted to a tremendous degree, he's going to come out of the well, and the end times will ensue. And Jesus, the prophet of Islam, and the 12th Imam will fight against the unbelievers and conquer and Islamize the world. Now, the problem that this holds for those who are not Shiites, or 12er Shiites, is that the 12th Imam's return is going to be triggered by tremendous persecution of the Muslims, according to the Shiite traditions. Persecution like has never been seen before. And so some of the mullahs in the Iranian regime have actually said, we can bring that on ourselves. We can trigger that. We nuke Tel Aviv, Israel is over. but we can sustain 10 or 15 million casualties in response, and that will bring back the 12th Imam. And so the problem is you have this idea that here again is a religious idea and thus very hard to discuss or deal with or dislodge. And it could result in the deaths of tens of millions of people or more if they decide to hasten the coming of the 12th Imam in this way. Yes, sir?
So speaking of deaths of people, I was intrigued by your answer to the question about your motivation for your studies. And you told a nice little family story about liking where they live and then being exiled. Did I hear you correctly to say that a member of your family was killed?
Yeah, my great-grandfather.
Your great-grandfather was killed?
Yes,
Is that
Stilianos
a motivation for you?
What's that?
Is that a motivation for you?
You mean I see. Like, oh, you killed my great-grandfather, I'll get you.
No, I'm just asking you a question. You can add what you want. I'm just asking you a question.
No, I didn't find that out actually until, that was one of the last pieces of the story.
Yeah, it was. You kind of did it as an afterthought.
Yeah, because it was one of the last pieces of the story that I found out, and so it's not really fit in with the rest. What happened was, I'm going to tell you real personal family stories now, since you asked. I have some cousins in Greece who I never even knew. But when my mother died, it turned out that I was the inheritor of a slice of an island in Greece, a very small island in the Aegean. And my uncles owned the other 2/3 of it, and I owned 2/3 of it. And I thought, hey, cool, I own an island in Greece. I'm going to go there. But then my cousins came over. I never met them. And this was like 2005. And they said, here, sign this, and you're going to sign over your piece of the island to us because we want to sell it. And I thought, what a pity, but I went along because what am I going to do with an island in Greece anyway? And that's when they gave me a photograph that I have on my wall in my office of my great-grandfather, and apparently my grandfather took the picture because his little brother and his 2 sisters are in it, and my great-grandmother, but he's not in it. And they all look, the way people did when you took pictures in 1918 or whatever. And it's very interesting. And they told me the story about how there was a Turkish soldier who was watching them as they were leaving. And then my great-grandfather went back from the boat because they left something in the house. And the Turkish soldier killed him when he went back. And I'd never known any of this. And that was 2005. I'd already written 3 or 4 books on Islam. So it's not likely that I was motivated by some idea of twisted revenge for a murder that's 100 years ago. Yes, sir?
In your research, what has inspired individuals to take on religious violence or acts of religious violence?
Well, let's go to their own words. I have here marked, and I didn't refer to it during the talk, some of the words of the people who have committed religious violence. For example, Anwar al-Awlaki, who, of course, was involved with the plotting of the attack by the Fort Hood shooter, as well as by the attack of the guy in the airplane over Detroit, Christmas 2009, who hid the bomb in his underwear, and all he did was injure himself. And in any case, al-Awlaki, who was an imam in Washington, there's an interesting PBS documentary about Muhammad that was produced right after 9/11, and it's funny because they obviously don't know who Anwar al-Awlaki was, and of course he wasn't the famous, notorious Anwar al-Awlaki at that time. They're showing this wonderful moderate Muslim staffer of a congressman going to prayers on Capitol Hill. And there are all these prominent Muslims in the audience, like Nihad Awad and Ibrahim Hooper of CARE and others. And there's Anwar al-Awlaki preaching the sermon. And so he was quite mainstream and accepted as a moderate. He was actually praised in the New York Times right after 9/11 as a moderate. And he himself said, the hatred of kuffar, unbelievers, is a central element of our military creed. So he was motivated by the hatred of unbelievers. And the Quran in chapter 48, verse 29 says, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but harsh to the unbelievers. And so it may be that was one of the kinds of things that he had in mind. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of the 9/11 plot, he and his other plotters, they wrote a response to the indictment You know, they're under indictment, their trial is just dragging on indefinitely with delay after delay after delay. In 2009, 5 years ago now, they wrote the Islamic response to the government's 9 accusations. That is the 9 points of the indictment against them. And they say this: many thanks to God for his kind gesture and choosing us to perform the act of jihad for his cause and to defend Islam and Muslims. Therefore, killing you and fighting you, destroying you and terrorizing you, responding back to your attacks, are all considered to be great legitimate duty in our religion. These actions are our offerings to God. And so it would appear that, he says, it would have been the greatest religion. This is very important. Let me go on from there. He says, in addition, it is the imposed reality on Muslims in Palestine, Lebanon, Afghanistan, Iraq, in the land of the 2 holy sites, that is Saudi Arabia, and in the rest of the world, where Muslims are suffering from your brutality, terrorism, killing of the innocent, and occupying their lands and their holy sites. Nevertheless, it would have been the greatest religious duty to fight you over your infidelity. So he's saying, you Americans are doing all these terrible things all around the world and terrorizing Muslims all around the world, which is debatable, but anyway, this is certainly a claim that is often made. And then he says, however, it would have been the greatest religious duty to fight you over your infidelity. In other words, to fight you simply because you're a non-Muslim, which would hark back to the idea that is enunciated in chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran that I quoted before. Fight against those who do not obey Allah and his messenger, and do not forbid what he has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. It just says fight them, like chapter 8, verse 39, fight until religion is all for Allah. Not fight the unbelievers who have a bad foreign policy that you hate, or fight unbelievers who are terrorizing you in Palestine or whatever, supposedly, but just fight unbelievers, full stop. And that's what they said. You see, it would have been the greatest religious duty to fight you over your infidelity. So here again, I emphasize to you, it's not I who am making that up. You asked about the motivations of people who commit violence in the name of religion. This is the motivation that they say themselves. The Taliban jihad leader, Baytullah Masood, said in 2007, Allah on 480 occasions in the Quran, in the Holy Quran, extols Muslims to wage jihad. We only fulfill God's orders. Only jihad can bring peace to the world. Then we will continue our struggle until foreign troops are thrown out. Then we will attack them in the US and Britain until they either accept Islam or agree to pay the jizya, that tax that is specified in the Quran. Yes, ma'am?
Hi, what do you think, what's your favorite verse in the Quran?
My favorite verse?
What do you think is most beautiful?
The verse of the throne. You know the verse of the throne? Over him, it's, I can't, I want to do justice to it. Ayat al-Kursi.
Chapter 2, verse 255.
255, thank you. I was looking at 156 and 56. I had 56 in my head. Allah, the ever-living, the self-subsisting, by whom all subsist. There is no God but He. Neither slumber seizes Him nor sleep. To Him belongs all that is in the heavens and all that is in the earth. Who is there who might intercede with Him, save with His leave? He knows what lies before them and what is hidden from them, whereas they cannot attain to anything of His knowledge, save what He wills them to attain. His dominion overspreads the heavens and the earth, and their upholding wearies Him not. He is all high, all glorious.
I have a question.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
I just read one written by a British writer, and I'm not sure if I quoted quite right. He was saying something that in negotiations it's okay to lie to infidels or Muslims if it promotes the cause of Islam. Is
Yeah.
that something, do you left anything wrong?
Yeah, that's based on the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, which Yasser Arafat referred to. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah was, according to Islamic tradition, a treaty that was entered into by Muhammad with the pagan leaders of the Quraysh tribe. Muhammad was a member of the Quraysh tribe, but they had refused to accept his claim to be a prophet, and he had left Mecca to go to Medina, and he had gone to war, and there were various battles between him and the Quraysh leaders. In the year 628, he concluded this treaty with the pagans of Mecca, in which he agreed to various disadvantageous points. That if somebody fled from the Quraysh to the Muslims would return him. But if somebody fled from the Muslims to the Quraysh, they wouldn't have to return him. Things like that. And they started to write the agreement, and Muhammad said, "Write Muhammad, the apostle of Allah." And the Quraysh complained and said, "Hey, if I thought," Abu Sufyan, the head of the Quraysh, said, "If I thought you were the apostle of Allah, I wouldn't be fighting you. Don't write that." And Muhammad said, "Okay, we won't write that." His followers were getting hot about it because they thought he was giving away too much. But he assured them that it was going to be okay. And ultimately, he broke the treaty on a technicality. A woman fled from the Quraysh to the Muslims, and he said, "I don't have to return her because it's a woman." And the agreement says, if a man flees from the Quraysh to the Muslims, I have to return it. And so, in any case, this became the basis for the idea of, in Islamic law, entering into a treaty in order to gather strength to fight again more effectively later. And the treaty can last up to 10 years, or can be broken if it's advantageous to the Muslims to do so before that. So Yasser Arafat went to Oslo and entered into this agreement. And then he went home and he said to the people that were there to hear him in Arabic, "Remember Hudaybiyah." In other words, don't worry, I haven't given away anything. Yes?
Well, is there any differences between English version of Quran and Arabic version?
It depends on which English version you got. And like I mentioned earlier, Abdullah Yusuf Ali tends to whitewash some controversial and uncomfortable passages like saying beat them lightly and so on instead of just beat them, which is what the Arabic says.
You're saying there are some differences, right?
Oh, well, it depends. Like I say, there are many, many translations. I mean, I have over 20 myself. And you have to compare. And also, there are plenty of resources for being able to even go into the etymology of the words that are available. And so it's I think, unwise to rely just on one. But some are more accurate than others. Yes, sir?
Is there direction or strategy in the Quran that just talks about plain and simple population growth, overwhelming the infidel by birth rate?
No, I don't know of any such passage. I know that Ouari Boumediene said that. Ouari Boumediene was the Prime Minister of Algeria. In 1974, he was speaking at the UN, and he said, "We will conquer you with the wombs of our women," and was actually threatening that sort of demographic overwhelming. But
Muslim countries growing?
yeah, actually, yes. I mean, of course, you're talking about a lot of countries where polygamy is legal, and certainly where having children is encouraged far more than it is in the West.
Disproportionately, Western countries, our birth rates are going down.
Yes, that's quite right. And so, certainly going to make for an interesting future for the West, because, I mean, we're all well aware, of course, that not all Muslims hold to this supremacist agenda. The problem is that those who are working aggressively to bring it about. And as they increase in numbers, I fear for the future in terms of strife in various countries when they try to assert Islamic law. I mean, there are already areas of Europe, like Malmo in Sweden, and some parts of the Molenbeek area in Antwerp, I believe it is, and some parts of London, where the law of the land doesn't hold any sway at all. And even police and firefighters don't go into Malmo. And it's just Islamic law holding sway. Now, as those areas grow, either the authorities of the governments of those various countries are going to have to assert the law of the land, or they're going to have to not assert it. Those are the only choices. And there's going to be conflict.
Could the inverse also generate in that non-radical populations of Muslims revolt against being asked to submit to all that?
Well, we can certainly hope that, and there are certainly a few courageous individuals of that kind who have stood up against it. There's a poet, actually, in Denmark, who is a Muslim. He was raised a Muslim, and I believe his name is Yaqub Hussein, but I'm not sure of that. In any case, he is 18 years old, and he wrote this poetry harshly criticizing his upbringing and Islam, and now he's under death threats and has been put up on charges for hate speech and racism, which is kind of absurd because he's a Palestinian Muslim. But in any case, he was exposed to Western ideas, Western notions of human rights, of the equality of dignity of all people before the law, of the freedom of speech, and so on, and he found those appealing. And certainly if you have enough people who find those things appealing, I would hope that they fight for them, whatever their creed or background.
So that information doesn't get there.
Yes, sir.
I've heard lots of stories about
Oh, sorry. I'll get you. Yes.
People have seen like images and depictions of Muhammad and gotten incited violence over that. But
Yes.
I've also heard that come from the Quran. So can you comment on that?
Well, certainly the idea of images, of depictions of the human form is strictly forbidden in Islam. And so the idea that you would have a drawing of Muhammad, however innocuous, many Muslims would consider to be offensive. The problem becomes when they start to riot and kill. You know, there were cartoons in the paper in Denmark, and people were being murdered in Turkey and Afghanistan and elsewhere over these things. People who had nothing to do with these cartoons. And the other problem with the cartoons was that a lot of the Western media, which should have been standing up for the freedom of speech and saying the freedom of speech is most important wherever and whenever it's challenged, instead they surrendered and kowtowed, and they said, we're not going to print these cartoons, we don't want to print what is offensive. Well, they never had any problem printing a picture of a crucifix in a jar of urine, which won an award, National Endowment of the Humanities Award. That was okay. Then they talk about censorship. But when it comes to offending Islamic supremacists, it's another matter. And you've got to think, well, they just know, Christians might get mad, but they're not going to kill you. Whereas these people are killing people over cartoons, and you never know. And so the problem is that kind of cowardice leads to self-censorship, and self-censorship leads to legal censorship, and that is the end of a free society. Yes, sir.
So it seems like a lot of issues in this world arise from religious conflict because people think that they're entitled to being right because their God says that they're right. If the entire world was one religion, be it Christianity or Islam or Buddhism, do you see peace in the world?
No, I don't think that would bring peace. I think that if the entire world were one religion, then all the various sects of the one religion would fight each other. It's human nature, And this is why I believe so strongly in a secular society. I don't believe in any established religion, or that there should be an established religion of any kind, because you're never going to get people to agree on core fundamental points in conscience. You're never going to achieve that. There can be missionaries, Christian missionaries, there can be dawah, there can be anything, all sorts of initiatives to convert people, and you'll convert a lot of people, but you're never going to convert the whole world. And so we simply have to achieve some sort of a basis on which people who differ in conscience on fundamental issues can live together with mutual respect and harmony and equality of rights. And that was the great idea of the U.S. Constitution and the idea of non-establishment of a religion. That everybody would have equality of rights before the law and respect one another and not try to impose the hegemony of their views over the others. And everything that I do is designed to try to advance that idea against the things that are threatening it. But it is unfortunately everywhere in retreat in the world today. Yes, sir.
I thought of this question because you mentioned a way for people of differing ideas to have some way of talking. And I don't know if this was always the case, but it seems like, especially now in the U.S., partisanship is quite strong. And in a lot of places there's kind of, a mistrust and a difficulty of people on the left and right.
Yeah.
You know, trusting that the other person is maybe, you know, trying to do something and saying, I just think that you're doing it wrong, not that you're kind of out to get me. And so what would you, like, do you have a sort of ideal of an ideal situation that people would be able to come together and, talk about it? What would...
Yeah, I do, and I couldn't agree more. You're absolutely right. This mutual respect is vanishing, and the mutual regard, enough respect for the other as a human being to grant that they may have a valid point of view and to engage them rationally. It's gone. I mean, look, my whole career I'm a poster child for the vanishing of that. I came out in good faith, and I'm talking about facts. I'm quoting the book. Everything I'm saying is backed up. And I'm absolutely a demon and a horrible person who nobody should listen to. And like I say, it ain't personal. They do this to everyone. And the left increasingly is authoritarian and against any kind of dissent. And wants, instead of engaging, instead of discussing rationally, they want to smear and defame and demonize their opposition and ultimately make it illegal to have any point of view other than their own. And what's happened to me is just one small example of what's happening to a lot of people and to a lot of issues where it's no longer even acceptable in polite discourse to have an honest, rational discussion. And like I say, that's the death of a free society. You know? You can say that I'm a terrible guy all you want and go and read the rap sheets on the internet all about my supposed atrocities, most of which, if not all of which, are entirely trumped up, distorted, and outright fabricated. And you can think whatever you want about me. But the reality is that this initiative against the freedom of speech is advancing. And it is inimical to a free society. And it is advancing on many fronts today, and it is aided and abetted even by the President of the United States and his former Secretary of State. You know, there's the Benghazi scandal and all that. And without getting into all that, there is one point I want to make about it. It is now clear, because of the emails that were recently released, that the Obama administration fastened on that Muhammad video and decided to blame it for this attack when actually it had nothing to do with it. It had actually 17 views on YouTube before it was blamed for the attack. And the Muhammad video criticizes Muhammad. Barack Obama, ineptly and stupidly, but it criticizes Muhammad. Barack Obama went to the UN and said, the future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam. So does that mean that even legitimate criticism of where people are incited to violence or point to Muhammad's example to justify violence, when people are chanting Khaybar, Khaybar, Ya Yahud, Jaish Muhammad Sa Yaud, can we not talk about that? Khaybar, Khaybar, O Jews, the army of Muhammad will return. Khaybar is an oasis in northern Arabia where Muhammad went and massacred the Jews who were there. And it's a war cry, a battle cry of jihadis to this day. Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, was talking to the father of Tyrone Woods, who was a Navy SEAL who was murdered at Benghazi. And she said, we're going to have that filmmaker arrested and prosecuted. And they did. And he was in jail for a year. They trumped up something about how he had violated his probation. You said, maybe he's a shady character, maybe he's a criminal. What difference does that make? He was not in jail for being a criminal. He was in jail for saying something that offended Islam. And that is not illegal in the United States. At least not yet. But that was one big step toward it. And it is the demonization of the opposition in all spheres that is a huge threat to the society that has been a source of great prosperity and great human flowering for a couple of centuries now. You all are here in this university, and only one point of view is allowed. I know that. And only one perspective is acceptable. And that is a symptom of the problem I am discussing. The thing is, just ponder what might happen if you end up holding a point of view that is one of those that's not allowed. Do you really want to be in that position? Or would it be better to live in a society where all points of view were allowed and freedom of speech were open and ideas would live and die on the basis of their truth, not on the basis of who in power found them acceptable or unacceptable? That's the kind of society I hope for. Yes, sir.
Yeah, what specific opinions are you referring to that are suppressed by our university? Because I've been through a lot of classes where any and all ideas have been openly discussed.
Okay.
And their pros
Well,
and
I've
cons
written
to be
13 books about Islam and jihad. I've written a guide to the Quran. I've written a biography of Muhammad. I've written an examination of the historicity of the texts about Muhammad. I've written several books about jihad. I've written 2 comparisons of Christianity and Islam with regard to violence and other questions. And I would say with 99.9% certainty that none of the points of view that I represent are discussed or even considered acceptable to be discussed in this university or most other universities in this country. And I do not believe that any of you who read any of my books would honestly be able to say that there's anything hateful in them or anything inaccurate in them. And if you do find anything of that kind, if you chance to read one of them at any point in your life, please email me at director@jihadwatch.org and show me where I am speaking falsehood, and I will correct it. But in the meantime, I know that the ideas I represent are not acceptable in the university, and I know that the ideas I represent are true, and that's a bad problem. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to say, I'm actually in a class on Islam right now, and some of the points of view that you have expressed were discussed in an open forum.
Glad to hear it.
We openly discussed them and came to the conclusion that there's a difference between freedom of speech and hate speech, which is a term that you've been intermixing throughout this lecture. And hate speech is not freedom of speech. It's not constitutionally protected.
What is hate speech?
Hate speech is speech that threatens or harms without any factual content that actually progresses a valuable idea.
And who decides what speech threatens or harms without any content that expresses a valuable idea? Who's the arbiter of what that is?
Well, that's a question about our judicial system.
No, it isn't. It's a philosophical question about the very concept of hate speech, because the problem is that the concept of hate speech is a tool in the hands of the powerful to silence the powerless.
Well, that's just a Hobbesian argument against the powerful. I mean,
Yeah.
we have a government where people review the law and look at the judicial system, and if you want to question our common law system and our precedent-based system, then you question our foundations of democracy.
No, actually, that's what you're doing. The First Amendment guarantees no infringement on the freedom of speech, and by inventing this concept and investing in whatever judge the power to determine what constitutes hate speech and what does not, you are the one who is obliterating the freedom of speech in any functional sense. Freedom of speech was designed to protect unpopular speech, speech that people found offensive for whatever reason, and not to protect speech that was innocuous. Speech that's innocuous doesn't need any protection. It is speech that was controversial in the time when the First Amendment was formulated, speech that challenged the reigning administration or the reigning ideas that needed to be protected. And the framers of the Bill of Rights knew that it needed to be protected and that had to be in there because they knew that otherwise it would be possible to silence legitimate dissent and that would be the end of the free society. And so by saying that hate speech is whatever it was that you said it was, the big problem is who gets to decide. And whoever gets to decide has a power to obliterate the freedom that was guaranteed to us by the First Amendment and was given to us for a very important reason. On that happy note, we are going to wrap up now. So thank you so much for coming. I do applaud you, especially those who disagree with me in these very dark days for the freedom of speech and for freedom in general. I do applaud you all for coming out and hearing me out, and I thank you for doing that. Any of you who have any interest in discussing any of these matters further with me, I'm a director at jihadwatch.org, and I would be very happy to hear from you. Thanks again.
Thank you for coming tonight. We hope to see you at future events. We did record this and we available online if you want to look at it at another time. Thank you.
Take care, man. Good seeing you.
Okay.
Bye. All right, bye, Cece. It's good seeing you.
Okay, let's
What's that? No, they're gonna happen in I think a week or two. Yeah. So no, I can't. I'm graduating in the fall. So yeah, I am. Yeah, I'm graduating really early. So otherwise, I would, but I really can't. So, but I'll definitely. What's up?
What are you going to do for graduate?
I still gotta figure that out, Like right now at KBC, I'm entering DC in summer again, but it's gonna be fun. So after that, I really don't know what's gonna happen. So I'll just have to hopefully have a job lined up. But
Do you think you're going to
where
stay here, or are you going to go back to San Fran?
I'm gonna go wherever I can find a job. So that could be just about anywhere, except for like Saudi Arabia because I wasn't welcome on being Jewish. But you know what I mean. It's just like anywhere where I can find a job, I'll go there. So I don't know. We'll see.